Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the first in our series of 4 liberal arts lunch and learn presentations. My name is Bill Hessert. I am the Director of Strategic Communications for the College of the Liberal Arts. And it's my pleasure now to introduce our moderator for today's presentation, Scott Bennett, the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies and Distinguished Professor of Political Science. Scott?
Great. Thanks, Bill. Good afternoon, everybody. Glad you could join us today. I hope that you and your families are doing well during these challenging times, both the months and past couple of weeks where we've all had some changing circumstances. On behalf of Dean Lang and everybody associated with the college, welcome to the first in our series of presentations by liberal arts faculty exploring different dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic. Over the past 3 months, our faculty, staff, and students have all faced changing circumstances because of the pandemic. Most obviously, we've all pivoted to remote education and remote meetings and seminars like this one. And in the research space, faculty have also pivoted. At my last count, we've had 49 new research projects started by our faculty that focus on different aspects of the pandemic. Faculty are examining changing political attitudes, physical and mental health, communications and messaging about the pandemic, issues of injustice in the administration of healthcare, economic impacts of the pandemic, and lots of other topics that cross a number of disciplines and a number of departments in the college. All of those studies are going to help us to better understand and presumably also respond to what's been an incredibly pressing issue for everyone over the past few months. And I'd say that those studies also reflect the important role of the liberal arts in tackling those issues. Thinking creatively and critically, considering diverse viewpoints respectfully, communicating articulately are all core liberal arts values that we bring to the table for our students and for our faculty and staff. Now, our presentations over the next few weeks are going to showcase just a few of these projects. And so looking ahead, as a quick reminder, next Tuesday, June 9th, Kristen Buss, who is professor and head of our Department of Psychology, will speak on the development of social anxiety. Ray Block, professor of political science and African American studies, will discuss race, politics, and the pandemic and voter mobilization on Wednesday, June 17th. And Barry Ickes, who's professor and head of our Department of Economics, will be speaking on Thursday, June 25th. We'll be speaking about the economic recovery possibilities from COVID-19. All of those remaining lectures will take place at the same time as today, and there's no need to sign up again because one registration covers all 4 presentations. So I hope you'll be able to join us again over the next few weeks. We really do appreciate your interest in these presentations, and thanks for your continuing engagement with the college. In all of our seminars, the format will be similar. Our presenter will speak for about 15 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions. So please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your screen when you scroll over it. You can send those questions in at any time during the presentation, so there's no need to wait for the end. I will be compiling those questions and asking as many as we can in the time we have after the presentation. And I'm sure I'm going to have a few questions to ask Tima myself. So with those preliminaries out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Associate Professor Tima Moldogaziev. Tima joined Penn State last summer from the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. His research and teaching focuses generally on public financial management and fiscal policy. More specifically, he's looked at public sector capital markets, municipal debt structures and pricing, credit risk assessment, and management and regulation of local government finance and borrowing. The purpose of Tima's presentation today is to help us better understand how the COVID-19 crisis is threatening critical services at the local level. So Tima, the floor is yours. We'll look forward to your comments and having a chance to ask questions.
Well, thank you for a kind introduction. I need to figure out how to share my slides here. There you go. So I'll jump into it right away. Just as a reminder, in the United States, most critical services are provided at the local government level that we tend to enjoy on a daily basis. And by local governments, I mean cities, counties, townships, boroughs. But something that we sometimes forget, even those that are studying local government services, is that a great deal of these services are also provided by authorities and districts and other self-governing entities that we generally refer to as special purpose governments. So just sort of to illustrate a couple of maps to the left that you will see on your slides. These are from my recently published articles. The top one is the state of Georgia. And you'll find that special purpose government arrangements can be distributed unevenly geographically. They tend to be clustered around urban areas, and you can see Atlanta as sort of as a bright spot on the map of Georgia. And what you will find there is that there'll be at least a dozen counties, more than 100 cities, and more than 500 special purpose districts in just one metro area. So it would be fair to say that service delivery in the United States is a highly fragmented affair with lots of narrow niches such as drinking water, stormwater, transportation districts, community development districts, cemeteries, health districts, and so on. The bottom one is Houston metro area, and this is even more fragmented. What you will find, those gray spots, are water districts, or so-called municipal utility districts, and you'll find more than 2,000 of those in one metro area alone. Pennsylvania itself is highly fragmented as well. As of last year, there were more than 4,900 local governments in one state, and just a little shy of 2,000 of those were special purpose districts responsible for narrow service areas, as I listed, like drinking water, sewerage, and things like that. And in the United States, states will differ in how much support they will offer local governments in times of need. And it would be fair to say that right now, COVID-19 is bringing external economic shocks that are unparalleled in recent history in terms of just how much fiscal stress it is putting on local governments providing critical services. Unfortunately, what I'm finding in the current debates at all levels of government really is that special purpose governments are largely missing from the conversation. And that is unfortunate for a number of reasons that I will touch upon in the next slides. So what are the special purpose districts or governments? As you might find, there are pros and cons of organizing our local government services around narrow entities. Special purpose districts or governments have been lauded for their specialization. So if you are talking about clean water, we probably want people that know how to provide clean water running those facilities. There are economies of scale where local governments can actually compete with each other, but also with the private sector firms for delivery of certain services. So airport districts or cemetery districts might be a good example, or even library districts. Local government services through special purpose arrangements are also considered to be useful for linking benefits to costs. If you consume a lot of water, for example, you get to pay more for per unit basis. And one of the other things that can be either a pro or a con is that the SPGs, special purpose governments, are shielded from political and legal interference. And sometimes that is healthy, sometimes it's not. But what we're finding, and this is really the focus here, that in sort of decades of theoretical and empirical research, the specialized forms of organization are at a higher risk of failing doing so-called coarse-grained impacts from our environments. And coarse-grained impact is really this one large event that is disrupting not only services, but also resources that are flowing into general purpose and special purpose governments. And the last sort of big event that we have all experienced was the Great Recession of 2007 and 2009, and local governments have experienced the impact of that last shock until all the way to 2009, really. So we were just getting back on our feet, as one would say. So if past empirical evidence is of any use for today's big shock, is that very likely counties, cities, townships, and maybe even states, while they will be affected by this shock, they're more likely to survive and continue providing critical services than some of these special purpose districts for a number of reasons. And the reasons are here. The special purpose governments in the United States, just think about your local services, your drinking water, or your recycling company or authority that you're dealing with, or any number of those special purpose government arrangements. They have geographic boundaries, and they have sort of very narrow niches of services that they provide. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, they also depend on narrower sets of revenues to provide those services. Generally, they're not able to raise taxes, property taxes, or other forms of taxes without the permission of general purpose governments. Special purpose governments tend to rely primarily on fees and charges, which may or may not be under threat under specific, external shocks, as we're seeing right now. So basically, again, if you're thinking about your drinking water provider, right now a lot of individuals are experiencing, hardships with income, and the states are telling those water providers not to cut off services if people are not paying, their fees and charges, which sort of makes sense, but it also puts special purpose districts in a hard spot because they need to continue providing services, and they depend on those revenues for maintaining the facilities. The other thing to keep in mind with special purpose district, and this is where probably most of my research is that these narrow services tend to be highly capital intensive. So in other words, you need to put infrastructure worth billions of dollars to really begin providing services to individual households. Often these are referred to as invisible infrastructure. So if you think about drinking water, again, a lot of it is under the ground. You don't get to see it on a daily basis, but you do receive those services at your house. So highly capital intensive services then do demand more capital resources, and the way it's done in the United States, and again, there are a number of pros and cons of doing it this way. There is a municipal capital market in the US, which is a third bond market in addition to the treasuries at the federal level, the corporate bond market, and the municipal bond market. Last I checked, there were almost $4 trillion of debt outstanding by local governments, more than 50,000 of those in the United States that are actually borrowing through the muni market for their capital infrastructure needs. What it means in this instance is that not only special purpose governments need to continue, they need resources to continue services, pay the bills, pay their employees, and if, for drinking water, certain chemicals are needed, they need, resources for those. But they also need to think about continued debt servicing, which can be pretty large on an annual basis. So you're talking about literally millions and millions of dollars that local governments and special purpose districts need to have in order to remain solvent. And the way this is structured to make municipal market more attractive is that it's a tax-exempt market. And as it is considered to be sort of a subsidized corner by the federal government and the state governments, it's also a relatively secure market. barring a big shock. So I've seen sort of in the media a couple of sort of suggestions. What if we allow special purpose districts not to pay or continue servicing their debt, which is sort of problematic because we always need to look at, who are the holders of local government debt. And very often these are pension funds. These are often, households, individuals that want a sort of a secure place to put their resources. And it's not clear to me whether letting these expire will actually help, the communities that are investing in these local government infrastructure. It is no doubt that COVID-19 is having, it's really big impact on people's lives. And, public health impacts are probably the most prominent at the moment. But what we are beginning to see is that states and counties and cities are running out of resources to provide some of the critical sort of services. And many have reported that during the last 2 months or so, they actually depleted any rainy day funds they may have had accumulated over the years. Governors and mayors beginning to talk about slashing services that are not as critical as some of the services at the general purpose government level. But what we're not seeing is that, again, special purpose districts are not a part of the conversation. And the first CARES Act, this is really the federal government's package, the $2 trillion package, has contained $150 billion package for state and local governments that primarily would go through the states, but cities and counties with populations of 500,000 or higher could directly petition for funds, which leaves really a lot of local governments in the United States outside of help. The next package, CARES 2 Act, supposedly, they're in the planning stages, has $1 trillion for special for states and local governments, but it's not clear how much of that will go to special purpose governments again. So just to illustrate in terms of the magnitude, this is data from literally a couple of weeks ago from California. And in California, there are 58 counties, there are over 500 cities, but also there are more than 5,000 special purpose governments. And half of debt at the local government level, for example, was with special purpose governments. And again, nobody's talking about these 47%. And if you sort of want a quick rundown of what these special purpose governments are and how critical their services are, sort of to merit really any attention, these are special purpose governments like municipal utility water districts, metropolitan water districts, hospital districts, county water, California water, community services, sanitation. So these are all very much critical services that we rely upon on a daily basis. In terms of where all of the resources come from to pay for not only service delivery, but servicing your debt, in California, the last fiscal year available, 31% was dependent on fees and charges, which are under severe stress right now. 29% are general taxes. These tend to be at the local level. Property taxes, these are relatively more secure, but tend to have a lagged sort of impact. So we are going to feel the general purpose governments and special purpose governments are going to feel the general tax revenue shortfalls probably in a year or so. Lease contracts and special assessments are more immediate resource issues. So if you are thinking about what the special assessment is, for example, these are your economic development, industrial development, districts that rely upon a large upfront investment, but the resources that you pledge are on any sort of new revenues, new businesses that are coming into that development district, which again, the economic activity is at a standstill for the last couple of months. So where does this leave us in terms of the safety of the critical services at the local level? Again, attention is shifting to SPGs, but very slowly. Water and utility energy groups, together with private sector counterparts, are now arguing that they need to be a part of this next package. And CDC began tracking water quality because a lot of localities are reporting that they don't have their own capacity to monitor quality of water levels. So that seems to be critical to me. I'd like to drink clean water, for example. Hospitals and health groups are also advocating for more attention from the federal government. And these are not necessarily the private corporations. These are hospital districts that are generally owned by counties or cities at the local level, where private healthcare groups do not find it attractive to operate. Again, for a number of reasons. And CDC began tallying up critical geographic areas where publicly provided health services are in danger of collapsing. One other area that is really important, a lot of us don't probably think about it on a daily basis, but cemetery districts are experiencing severe service overloads at the moment because of the case fatality rates of COVID-19. And many of these cemeteries are public health districts for a number of reasons. Not all families can afford these services, especially now during this crisis. The way it has been sort of discussed in the media is that it is really a catastrophic event for cemetery public districts, and they need help with dealing with COVID-19. Again, not only general purpose governments, but special purpose governments are also running out of budget stabilization or rainy day funds. They literally have no savings left. So where does it leave us in terms of solutions? Again, these are from decades of research on general purpose and special purpose organizations during times of economic hardship. So I have 5 points here. Some of these are more short-term solutions, medium-term and long-term solutions. In the short term, I think the federal government is the only government level that can and has the resources to help special purpose governments. So in the next CARES legislature, it is critical that the Congress actually includes special purpose governments into that aid package. In the medium term, if you remember, President Trump ran on an agenda of a $1 trillion investment to local governments. And if you think about Pennsylvania, a lot of infrastructure here is aging, drinking water or, transportation or other types of local infrastructure facilities. And that would be a really big help for a lot of local governments around the United States, especially special purpose districts. States and cities and counties do have schemes to help out their special purpose governments that are failing, but again, they're experiencing issues themselves, and probably they could put some of the funds coming from the federal government into these pockets and distribute them to the special purpose governments. Again, probably policymakers need to think about and prioritize what the critical services are that need to be provided on an ongoing basis. More of a medium to long-term solution. In the past, there were mergers and consolidations of these special purpose districts. In Pennsylvania, I'm reading over the last several months in terms of how things are arranged, but some of you may remember how school districts have been consolidated to provide economies of scale, but also sharing resources on an equitable basis. So maybe some mergers and consolidations are going to be necessary, say in a year or two. Some of the services may need to be brought into the general purpose government. So there are cities and counties that do provide water from water departments as part of a government, general purpose government. And it might be that if mergers and consolidations are not available, that general purpose governments need to actually take over some of these general purpose authorities and districts. And finally, as prior shocks have shown, we won't be able probably to save all of the special purpose districts. Some of them will actually die, as sort of the terminology goes, in terms of dissolutions and liquidations. So for policymakers, again, this is probably a medium to long-term focus. They need to decide which districts will be saved and which will be left to expire, to be liquidated, and so on. And maybe if the economy picks up, privatizing some of these might be a solution. So that is really a very brief introduction in terms of where we are given this huge income and sort of resource shock that local governments are facing. But now I'm happy to answer any of the questions that you have to expand more probably in some of these areas. Scott?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Tima. We are open for questions. So just as a reminder, if you'd like to submit a question or a comment, a thought, just do so by clicking on the Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your screen when you move your mouse around. So a first question, the way you describe this, it seems like this is a situation that's really, we've been vulnerable to disaster in that it seems like what you're depicting is kind of a lack of coordination, perhaps a lack of coordinated funding. And I had always been under the impression that just, local government would serve as a backup here, that's in Center County, that Center County government had a plan for all, the water district and all of these things. And I would have assumed that just local aid would simply flow down, that would be part of the planning process or what you would think would happen. But it seems like that's not the case. Is this an issue of local leadership kind of not being aware of these implications, or just that the money has all been spent in other ways very quickly?
So I think there are a number of factors at play here, and certainly some of the communities will have, resources that they can provide to their special purpose districts, especially the ones that are rather critical, right? So if these are energy utilities or water utilities, healthcare districts, and so on. Unfortunately, and for a number of reasons, special purpose districts have been created as separate legal entities. During normal times, that is useful because we can transfer some of the risks or shield our general purpose governments from the risks that these special purpose districts are taking, like airport districts and so on. So some of that is deliberate. The general purpose governments do not necessarily have an obligation to bail out special purpose districts. Right, so that's one thing. The other thing is what the discussion is, and including Pennsylvania, the state and township, boroughs, counties, they actually are running out of revenues and resources themselves. They are under stress. They're asking for help, and I guess the way these things go. There are mechanisms in place, but if we are not putting resources aside into those funds, then they're empty when you need them the most. And that is really the case with all of these, special funds that should have been there, but they're right. So for decades, we should have been putting funds aside for specifically emergencies like this. Although some would argue that a shock of the magnitude of COVID-19 that is going to shut down all movement and economic activity, for months was unexpected and can be considered, as this, mega event that you can't really shelter yourself against. So there are a number of these things that are happening. I wish we actually had the resources to help both the general purpose and special purpose governments. But unfortunately, the way things are in terms of fiscal positions, there aren't much. in terms of resources available right now to general purpose governments themselves. So I guess that is the unfortunate current affair.
Yeah. So one specific question following up on that is how the ability of governments to raise taxes or fees in this moment becomes potentially not an option. I mean, if you have an entity that needs to be fiscally solvent, but we have big GDP impacts, are we going to be able to use solutions like we've used in the past, adding another mill to property taxes or whatever it might be?
So this is probably a question more to macroeconomists, but yes, we will need to, at the sort of local level, state and local level, we will need to see where we can save money, maybe by slashing some of the spending. The problem with that, though, is that some of the services are increasing right now during the pandemic, especially social welfare net type services. This is the time where the revenues are going to be falling, but the pressure for services will be increasing. So it's not clear to me how much in terms of savings we can have by slashing spending side. On the revenue side, yes, increasing taxes probably is going to be necessary. Again, an impact of the magnitude of COVID-19 is probably going to be even bigger than the one we had during the Great Recession. When from 6 to 18 months, a lot of parts of the United States were in sort of in negative territory in terms of GDP growth. So yes, some increases in revenues are necessary. What I'm seeing in recent weeks also, there's a lot of talk in terms of borrowing and sort of plugging the holes right now that general purpose and special purpose governments have. So that might be an option under extraordinary services. As a person that studies debt finance, I wouldn't advocate for borrowing for current consumption. I would be more comfortable sort of recommending borrowing for revamping infrastructure, right now, as has been discussed over the last 2-3 years. So again, a combination of things is going to be necessary to come out of this big event. And remember, Pennsylvania's economy was projected to be in negative territory in November, even before coronavirus. So this is going to only exacerbate that economic situation.
Okay. Is the threat here larger in urban areas or rural areas, or is it something, or in particular states, or is this just something that really hits everywhere equally?
Again, in terms of where data is, where debt is, debt burdens, but also where the revenues are coming from, states and cities are experiencing this very severely. And if prior research can tell us anything, special purpose governments are going to be impacted even more. And we need to expect that this impact, fiscal impact, is going to be very broad on all of these special districts. That's why I believe it is unfortunate that we're not paying attention on special purpose governments, because that's where almost half of our services are. And as sort of policy response, do we want it to be a patchwork of sort of solving one problem at a time, or do we want to come up with a solution that will be more systematic than reacting to failures here and there? So I think my argument would be a more systematic approach is probably preferred. And sort of to answer the front end of your question, where the impacts are going to be, it's going to be both rural and urban. And in terms of a percentage of SPDs delivering services, rural areas are actually receiving more services through special purpose districts in a number of states. Pennsylvania would be in that category, but as these graphs show, California is definitely on that list. Although you could say, in terms of debt per capita, probably, some areas are more indebted than others. But yes, this is going to be felt across the board. And we'll have to live through this during the next 6 to 12 months.
So have we started to see impacts of some of these funding issues on services already? Or is it the case that we've been able to plug the holes temporarily and this is something that is looming? And I think about that question in part related to one of your possible solutions, which is maybe not solutions, that's not the right word, but SPGs may fail. They may be merged, we may have new circumstances. It's hard to imagine the water district failing because, as you pointed out, we need to have clean water. So are we starting to see impacts, or is that a longer term issue if we can't solve the problem?
Well, the layoffs already began for some special purpose districts. So school districts are already talking about slashing teachers and support staff. The cemetery districts are saying that they need to hire many more people to existing employees that they have, but they are unable to do so. The water utilities, as I said, beginning to organize for sort of asking for help during the next round of, federal legislation. They're saying that some of these local water utilities are running out of chemicals to clean water. And so this is spring now. We know, there's going to be a storm. We just had one today. And you may need certain chemicals to clean up your water sources if there was a contamination in the river or wherever you draw your water from. So in terms of public health, community safety, all of those are saying that they're running out of resources. And then in particular, some parts of the United States will be probably more vulnerable. I mentioned the research on Georgia, but a lot of coastal communities are now getting ready for the hurricane season. And it's not clear how they're going to face that if there's a landfall on any number of those cities. Some coastal cities get flooded every year pretty much now. On the Atlantic coast. So again, COVID-19 is already putting a lot of pressure. Local governments and special purpose districts are, providing services the best they can. But what is clear at the moment after, in some places 30 to 45 to 60 days of this stay-at-home rules, a lot of these entities are very short on resources to continue providing those services.
Okay, thank you. Just a reminder to the audience, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A. So Tima, you haven't been here long enough for this, but I've seen a couple of cycles of it in State College. So about every 10 years, we have a debate over consolidating our local governments. So currently we have State College Borough, Patton Township, Ferguson Township, and so on. And you drive 3 miles and you get through 3 different municipalities. Is this kind of circumstance, so it's a very fragmented set of governments, the SPGs are fragmented. Is this kind of crisis a moment where you might encourage the kind of government consolidation that has been proposed in the past? Is that not the solution? Or would aligning water districts and cemetery districts and school districts, would that kind of coordination be sensible? Is it more likely to happen in a moment like this? Or are we more likely to continue in the same patterns?
So there are a number of probably factors to think about. Consolidation by itself is not necessarily an end, goal. There are a number of things that need to be considered, whether there are savings that are expected, whether there's expertise at the local level. And in the United States, unlike probably many other countries, the political will of citizens is really important. So that's one thing. And in terms of this conversation, in the US, consolidations did indeed occur around sort of big fiscal shocks when communities decided to pool their resource bases together. And again, sort of one of the bigger consolidation issues are probably the city of Louisville and the surrounding county, in terms of bringing resources together and save the city. So this might be actually one of those, situations when consolidation is a reasonable thing to do. Unfortunately, again, there are enough examples of other things, like the bankruptcy of, say, Detroit, where no consolidation has occurred because surrounding communities were unwilling to be consolidated into one entity, or actually, as the term goes, to cross-subsidize each other's services. In the short term, it's generally based on the perspective of citizens, it's probably not a good idea to cross-subsidize, but in the long term, probably that is a good solution for a number of regions, especially in Pennsylvania, where population is dwindling, except for Pittsburgh and Philadelphia area. A lot of, pretty much every county in the state has experienced a decrease in population, and this is not the first year that it has happened. So again, consolidation might be a solution again, but you need to think really carefully how to arrange it.
Okay, great. So from what you've seen, are local leaders recognizing these issues and talking about either coming together for coordination or talking systematically about, do we go for the long-term debt approach, or do we just hope for a federal, an influx of federal funds? Are local leaders recognizing and tackling these issues of the SPGs?
Well, it depends on the locality and the arrangement that they have for intergovernmental cooperation, and some states are better than others. It can be top-down or bottom-up. So I'm not, again, very familiar with Pennsylvania here, but I'd say California is better organized than Georgia, and Texas is better organized than, say, Indiana. Those are the states that I have data for and looked at during the last couple of months. I'm hoping there is an sort of an organized way of approaching these issues in this community. I'm finding that Center County is a relatively well-organized jurisdiction with a lot of local governments actually working together. So again, as a resident of this county, I'm hoping for the best. Beyond that, I don't really know.
Okay. Let me make a broad observation and see if you have any thoughts on this. What you're talking about here with the SPGs and the local governments in the states seems like sort of a microcosm of our bigger discussions about federalism and state and federal coordination on responses to COVID, or really many other crises that we have had over time, where if you get different guidance and you get different states tackling COVID in different ways, you may get very different outcomes. So it strikes me that those discussions that we've had at the national level really parallel your call for local groups to come together and figure out some kind of a coordinated plan. Would you say, is that right? Is it very different because we're dealing with locales rather than federal and state entities?
Well, the US is a large country with very different economic probably dynamics depending on where you go. What I often sort of come across is a discussion of the US being a laboratory of democracy, different areas trying out different things and learning from each other in terms of what works and what doesn't, and that's probably a good approach because innovation can be tried out in different parts of the U.S. and can spread to other parts if successful. So in that respect, there are a number of states that know how to provide fiscal oversight and fiscal help to their local governments, even before they begin facing fiscal distress and defaults. North Carolina is a good example in terms of offering help to their localities, but also making sure that they know where there are resource needs if help needs to come. Utah is another state, but then there are other states that are not ready not only for COVID-19, but we saw during the Great Recession sort of the collapse of basically local services in a number of states. So again, I think there are enough examples in the United States to learn from. The willingness to learn from those experiences and adapting to certain jurisdictions seems to be missing in a number of areas. You can blame, obviously, maybe partisanship that seems to be getting worse and worse, in different parts of the United States, or inability or lack of capacity at the local government level to really introduce those lessons from other jurisdictions. I'm sort of an optimist. There are enough examples in the US that we can learn from and could work in different places. Obviously, local specifics will have to be considered when implementing those. And there's really no sort of Republican or Democratic solution, as everybody's talking about. There are policy solutions that may or may not work under different conditions. Instruments, in my view, cannot be political.
Well, those are some of the questions that you and others in the School of Public Policy are certainly going to be talking about. And what lessons do we get out of this moment, and whether it's SPGs, states, or other elements of governance, I think. So I think that's actually a good optimistic note to end on, that we have some lessons in different places and that we hope we can learn from them. Tima, thanks so much for sharing your research and your thoughts on this. Let me just remind everybody again in the audience that our next presentation is next Tuesday, June 9th, 12:05, same time, same place. Kristen Buss will be talking about the development of social anxiety, who, how, and what can be done. We hope that anxiety over our water supplies and our education systems are not something that we're going to have to continue to be worried about, but we keep getting new things put on our radar all the time. So Tima, thank you, and thank you to everybody in the audience for tuning in and submitting your questions. And I hope to see you all next week. No, thanks everybody.